Hey everyone, and welcome to another very special Talking Insomnia episode. We have Robert with us. So glad you're here. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Daniel. It's great to be here. A little bit surreal, but glad to be here.
I imagine you've seen other episodes, on the channel, and now you're here. Is that why it's a little surreal?
Exactly. Probably every episode. So
No, I've heard that before. But yeah, with that said, again, so glad you're here. And for those of you who don't know Robert, who don't know you, we actually connected first several months back. You had a call with me, and then I had a sense that you would be a good fit for our immunity program, and we talked about it. You joined, and so glad you're here, and that things ended up, going so well for you. But with that said, tell us the story. How did you start having trouble sleeping?
sure. So I was, an incredible sleeper most of my life. My normal sleep, I would sort of struggle to stay awake at night, honestly, and zonk out, usually reading every night around the same time, and usually a solid 8 hours, maybe get up once or twice, wake up, but fall right back to sleep. And 99% of the time, never an issue. And any past sleep issues I had were really, tied to really easily identifiable specific factors. So if I was having a lot of stress at work or in a relationship, that might, cause me to toss and turn at night and never falling asleep, but you have those middle of the night awakenings and your brain gets hold of a thought and it's off to the races and you can't comment for a few hours. So I've had those in the past, but whenever something like that would happen, if it was work stress, well, once I got past whatever project was causing that stress, right back to sleeping normal, and never really thought much about the sleep component other than, I'm tired. Um, that sort of changed about 13 months ago. So August 2022, early August, it was just sort of a perfect storm of personal issues that all occurred for me at the same time and led to sort of this 2-day prolonged anxiety attack, which was a rare thing for me because normally I don't have much anxiety. I don't have sort of general anxiety. I would get it time to time, again, like work stress, that sort of thing, but nothing that disrupted my life too majorly. So I had this 2 days where I was basically on edge and awake pretty much the whole time. I had, what I now would know to classify as surrender sleep around 3 or 4 a.m. on the second night. But other than that, I was up, and that really only subsided after I remembered, I had in the back of my medicine cabinet some anxiety medication from a doctor that had prescribed to me about like 10 years prior when I was going through some relationship issues, and didn't really take much of it then because I didn't enjoy the effects of it too much, but I figured I was in sort of a desperate mode at that point. So I took one, and that calmed me down, and I was able to sleep that night for like a solid 9 hours, like had hit the pillow, went out, click, 9 hours later, like opened up, my eyes hadn't moved a muscle. I was just completely zonked out. And I said, okay, like, great. I'm back on track here. And this is all over. And that was a Saturday evening, and Sunday I went through my normal kind of off day, and then had work the next day, Monday. So I go to bed Sunday night thinking, well, let's get a good night's sleep because I got work in the morning. And that was a sleepless night. I did not sleep a minute that I'm aware of. And so that's sort of the origin story where it started.
Thanks for sharing that. And it's a common story. I'm sure you heard it before, that it starts with like an event, and then somehow there's some more sleep, and then it's like, okay, that was a little blip, but then it happens again, and now oftentimes is when we get really scared. We're like, oh, this must mean something is really off is happening. Was that similar to how you were interpreting this?
Yeah, exactly. Because those first 2 nights where I was awake, again, I wanted to sleep and was trying to, but I knew I was in this heightened state that was what was preventing me from sleeping. And so the fact I wasn't sleeping wasn't enjoyable, but like I got it. And then once I had this night where in my logical part of my brain is everything's fine. I'm past that. I feel fine. I'm not experiencing any sort of anxiety right now. And yet I just went to bed and laid here for 8 hours, where most nights I can hardly keep my eyes open. So, what's going on?
And what happened, from then on, like the next day, were you quite frazzled? Did you do something the next day, or were you just kind of like, oh, let's see what happens next night, or what happened next?
Yeah, super frazzled. My mother was the only person I had clued into what was going on at that point. And I have the joy, the benefit of working from home. So I was sitting right here, and she ran out to, get something over the counter for me to try and help me sleep. She had talked to the pharmacist, and they, I think, gave her like a Benadryl antihistamine, and told her this has basically the same active ingredient to make someone drowsy as a standard over the counter sleep medicine, but it doesn't have some of the other sort of nasty side effects. So she brought me that, and I tried that, and to no avail. It didn't do anything. So I got in touch with my doctor. I had to wait a few days to get a telemedicine appointment. So sort of in the interim, I was basically popping those anxiety meds at night that I had taken the few days prior to knock me out, and those sort of bridged the gap for the 3, 4, 5 nights till I was able to talk to my doctor.
So those nights you were taking those anti-anxiety pills, and you were sleeping some, but I'm guessing you were not sleeping well.
Yeah, not great. Obviously, it's, it then became like this hyperfixation. That's all I could think about. And, those would do enough to put me down for a few hours and get me through the day. But it was definitely a very confusing time.
Totally here. And so, but then finally you get this telemedicine appointment, and what does the doctor think or say, and what happens next?
Yeah, it was a very brief thing, and I just told him what was going on, and he basically said, "Okay, I'm going to write you a script for trazodone to take as needed," which seems to be the conventional first step for most people. And he said, "Just take it as needed. So if you can sleep without it, just don't take it. But if you need it, then take it." And at this point, I couldn't sleep without it. So I was taking it pretty much every night. Some nights just taking it at like 8 o'clock and be like, all right, I'm going to go to sleep at 9 and sleep through the night. Other nights being like, well, let's see. And then come midnight when I'm not asleep, that's when I would pop it. And to his credit, though, he also did prescribe me CBT. And the problem was that, he gave the initial prescription, advised I go through the hospital system he was associated with. When I got in touch with their, psychology unit, they basically said, well, we're super backed up. We can put you on a waiting list, like the waiting list to the waiting list to get an appointment in like several weeks. I'm like, well, that's not really helpful. But they said, because of that, you can go wherever you want with this, referral. So feel free to just kind of poke around locally and see what you can find. And I did. I didn't find any local CBT-I therapists. So I was kind of miffed by that. So I was like, well, I don't want to just do, if I'm going to do it, don't just do the normal CBT, but do the CBT-I. But also I didn't pursue it too strongly because my mindset at that point, having been such a great sleeper most of my life, was really, well, things will just sort of snap back at some point, and I'll get rolling. And, the CBT-I won't necessarily be something that I even need, because who can stay like this forever, basically.
Got it. And so, yeah, I understand. Like you had this, you've always slept really well. You're sort of just waiting for that to kick back in. But at this stretch, you're taking trazodone every night. And tell us, like, what's sleep like, and also like, how are you feeling during the day? How's the work going? How are you feeling in general?
In general, not that bad. I was sleeping fairly well and taking the trazodone for a time. And, there was even points where I'm like, well, I don't even need this, this is the night I'm not going to take and I'll be fine, and what have you. And again, it was still that mindset of, well, this just has to snap back to normal at some point. So it hadn't become any sort of major emotional, mental event at that point. It was still very much just, I'm not sleeping. This is really weird and confusing, but I'm taking these prescription drugs and they're doing the trick, and I'm able to get through the day and work and all that.
Yeah, I completely get it. And so yeah, what happens next? You're sort of like, maybe going towards CBT-I, but not really pursuing it that strongly. But yeah, what happens? What happens next?
Yeah. So as others before me have experienced, the trazodone just stopped working at some point where, maybe a few hours or it wouldn't do anything. So I get back in touch with the doctor. Meanwhile, again, I have to wait days and days to get my 30-second telemedicine appointment, which is, supposed to be 15 minutes, but ended up, I had to get the doctor to stretch to get to like a minute, because he basically got on. I was like, well, take melatonin too. Keep taking the trazodone, but take melatonin as well. So I did that, and I returned to sleeping well for a short period. And then when that stopped working, same thing again. So get in touch with the doctor again, and I wait a few days and not really sleeping, but I'm still, I've got these old anxiety meds where I'm like, well, this will get me a night or two. And then, so the third go around of the telemedicine, I was prescribed a low dose of quetiapine, which I think is better known rather by the brand name Seroquel. And that would knock me out pretty good. So I was kind of in that pattern for a while of jumping from one medication to the next.
Yeah, totally. And again, you don't really have a specific theory of why this is happening. It's just like something is off, but eventually it'll correct itself. Or did you have some idea? Do you have some theory of what was happening?
Yeah, I mean, I knew I could trace it all. That that sort of 2 day of overwhelming anxiety was basically, there was before and after. So before, never really sleep issues of any extent to get too concerned about. And after that, all of a sudden, everything changed. And I'm sleeping some taking these medications, but it's not like before. Whereas before it was like, zonking out at night, falling asleep on the couch. I'd had to be careful about, like, if it's 7 p.m. and I usually go to bed at 9 on a work night, like, I can't get on the couch because I'll fall asleep, and then I'll wake up at 2 a.m. and it'll throw everything off. So like, that's how kind of strong my sleep drive, my sleep confidence was. Like, I could sleep in this chair sitting here if I had, like, 15 minutes before my next meeting at work and I'm feeling drowsy. I could just do one of these and like take a quick nap. So I knew that was sort of the triggering event. I just, mentally I'm like, well, I changed something in my brain basically, but at the same time, well, I didn't have like trauma, like a physical trauma, like nothing physically changed, but somehow I got rewired in a way that isn't ideal at this point.
Totally. And so you're on this pattern of like, trying something, it stops working. Then we try something else, stops working. And now we're trying the Seroquel. And I'm guessing that also stopped working. You up the dose, or what happened next?
Yeah. At that, it was working, and it didn't really stop working in this phase of my journey. But what happened next was that, I knew medications weren't the answer, and I wanted to eliminate them. So I had, at this point done some Googling and tried to figure out, what can I do here? And, CBT-I, which we talked about, is sort of the main cure that gets rolled out there as this golden standard, 70 to 80% success rate, et cetera, et cetera. And I did start looking back at like, well, let me see if I can find local like CBT therapists to work with. And I was talking to a guy, but I also started doing, sleep restriction, because I saw, well, that's the core component of CBT-I. I don't really prescribe to the sleep hygiene stuff because, again, like I've fallen asleep anywhere and everywhere. Like I'm behind the wheel, so like not for extended periods, but like it's happened. And like I've been at basketball games with 20,000 cheering fans and been like, you know, crazy environment, and I can barely keep my eyes open. So like not watching TV 2 hours before bed and this and that, like I knew that wasn't really what it was. So I figured though, well, maybe this sleep restriction is something. I've done that before. So I sort of went down that path, self-administered, which, you know, there's, I'm sure some actual CBT-I rules and regulations I didn't adhere to, but I basically was like, you know, I'm just going to exhaust myself. So I set a sleep window basically like midnight to 5, you know, 5 hours, which they said is like the recommended minimum. And so I would stay out here in my living room until about 11:30, and that's when I would like get ready for bed, and with the goal of like fall asleep midnight, wake up at 5. So that was my next venture.
And what happened?
My first attempt, it actually went very well. I was, you know, my goal or my plan was basically do whatever till like 9:30. Then 9:30 to 10:30, I could watch TV, and then 10:30 to 11:30, no screens, and I would read. And that 11:30 is when I would go to bed, and I would be falling asleep on the couch, watching TV, reading. Like there were nights that it was just like effectively asleep for that like 2 hour period where I'm on the couch, not like deep sleep, but like the, you know, head nodding while watching a movie or like reading a book and, you know, stuck on the same paragraph, and next thing I know 40 minutes have passed, and that sort of thing. And even like I went over to a few friends' houses to just hang out, and we'd be watching a game on TV and I'd be dozing off, you know, in the recliner. And I'm like, well, this is positive, because that was a pretty common occurrence for me before, and it's working its way back. So things seemed to be going well. I was sleeping through the night. Things were going in the right direction. And then I had a speed bump, and, you know, I stupidly, I guess, thought it was going to be a linear process. Like, oh, you're getting more tired and things are getting better. Why would you go back to a sleepless night again? That doesn't make any sense. So I had a speed bump. I'm like, all right, pull out the Seroquel again, like just get a good week's sleep, and, you know, get through work, get through all that, and then we'll try it again. So I did like a week of the Seroquel. Then I had another go at the sleep restriction, and it wasn't as good as the first go around. I wasn't really dozing off on the couch quite as much. Like I said before, it was okay, but I could tell like this isn't working like it did before. And then I had another speed bump, and response was basically the same as the previous time, which was, okay, pull out the Seroquel again. Let's reset, get a good week of sleep, and then we'll try this again. And the third time around with the self-administered sleep restriction is really where I began my downward spiral, I guess you could say, because prior to that, again, in my head, it was like, there were signs that I could sleep, and I just figured, again, like, this can't be it. Like, I can't just have gone to like, boom, perfect sleep, to can't sleep at all the rest of my life, and good luck. So when I tried the sleep restriction the third time, and it was even worse than the prior 2 times, that's when it started to kind of click for me. So I restricted my sleep for a few nights in a row, but I was still getting very little sleep. So like 4 hours a night maybe. And that's like, you know, I'm sleeping like 12:30, 1, 2 in the morning till like 4 or 5 in the morning. So not great. And sustaining that for a few days to the point where like I should really be exhausted at this point. And then like the 4th or 5th night in, I was on the couch and not dozing off, but like I felt tired. So let me just try to go to bed at a normal time. And I did. And I got a good night's sleep, you know, like 8 hours. So I'm like, oh, that's good. But the next night I actually went out with friends to a concert. And so didn't even get home till like midnight, and still just didn't sleep much that night. And the next 3 nights, whatever it was, also did not sleep much. And so that's when that's when, the gears started turning, and I'm like, oh, this could be a real problem.
Yeah. So now, you've heard that, CBT-I and sleep restriction is the biggest component. That is kind of the gold standard. You try that a couple of times, and now that seems to like not work anymore. It sounds like this is the point where it goes from like some concern, but it's more like a nuisance that it will fix itself eventually, to like now it's more like, okay, this could be a real problem. Something like that is starting to happen. But is that right? And just take us forward.
100%. Yeah. So it's almost like, the true insomnia experience is extremely mental and emotional. And up to that point, it was more like I had sleep disruption. And then this was when, it almost really started for me. So like, I guess it was like November, late November. So I had managed a few months of just like, well, this stinks, but like I'm making it through. And that's when things kind of changed. So at this point, it was the week of Thanksgiving, and I was off work, and I had planned to go on this solo trip to New York City. Rather, I'm from Syracuse, New York, Syracuse University. I'm a huge SU sports fan, and they were playing down in Brooklyn at the Barclays Center in sort of a early season basketball tournament, non-conference basketball tournament. So I had that circled on my calendar for a while, wanted to go to that. And I sort of waffled on taking the trip and booking it
Because of the sleep issues?
Because of the sleep issues, 100%. And then finally, I'm just like, well, don't let the insomnia win. Go do it and, have fun and make the most of it. And like, it'll be great. Or it might not be great, but do it anyway. And so I booked it shortly before, and I went down, and I took Amtrak, took the train, which I normally do, and normally I'll sleep on the train. It's not a given, but pretty frequently I would, and I definitely didn't this time. And what made it worse is that like everyone else on the train is asleep, including the person next to me, like the entire time. And I'm just kind of sitting there, and actually most of the way down, I had, I guess I forgot to mention this. I had over the previous weekend, when like I was really starting to go down that hill and realize things weren't great. I had did some research and found a CBT-I therapist, and not local, but someone I could do sort of those telemedicine appointments with, who was located a few hours away. And so we had scheduled this appointment for the Monday after Thanksgiving. So I'm about a week out from that at this point, and I'm just spending most of the ride filling out the intake form for our introductory meeting. And so I do that on the way down, and then I get down to Manhattan and check into my hotel, and that's really when like my anxiety started spiking. And I'm trying to enjoy myself and going to the games and keeping busy during the day, but like I'm just completely fixated. And the first night I'm there at the game, and however 10,000, 15,000 people in this place, and everybody's having a great time except for me. I'm just kind of like sitting there like, oh, just get me out of here. This is miserable. I just want to go back to my room and like get in bed, which I did, and did not sleep much that night. Tossed and turned, got a little bit. And I, was still kind of in my head, like, oh, I can't stay in bed. You got to get out of bed in the morning. But I was just like so exhausted and so over it that like I pulled out my laptop and I was, watching something on there, and got a little bit of like half and half surrender sleep, where like I'm dozing off watching something, and enough to just like, it was something, but it wasn't great. And so that next day, now we're into my second day there, and I had all these plans of things I wanted to do. I just scrapped them all. I'm like, I'm going to walk the entirety of Central Park because I need to wear myself out. And so I was staying probably 20 or so blocks south of the park. So I walked all the way there. I walked all the way through the park up to like Harlem, went out to lunch, took the train back, this and that, went to the game again that night, the second game of this tournament. And again, was like just completely miserable. And then It was a late game. It didn't even start till like 9. So it's going to like 11. And I just want it to end. I don't care if they win or lose. And then they go into overtime. And I'm like, this is just cruel torture. And then, I get out of there. I get back on the subway up to Manhattan. It was like a 20-30 minute ride. And I get to my hotel room. And again, I maybe like an hour sleep in the middle of the night, but pretty much nothing. And so I go from there, and I'm actually taking Greyhound home. So I get on the bus, and my mom's texting me to check in, like, oh, how was your trip? And that's when I told her, like, not great. Actually, it was terrible. And I tell her what's going on, and she said, well, why don't you come, because I live alone and wasn't in a great state at that point. So she said, why don't you come home for a few days and stay with her and my dad and my parents. So that is what I did at that point.
Got it. And you're telling your story very nicely, and I had really just one thing that came up to my mind is that I remember from the time we were working in the immune program that I think you were staying with your parents at that point. And did you where you are in the story now, you stay with your parents for a little bit. Did that kind of end up being where you stayed for quite a while?
Yeah, probably like 8 months, which not what I expected to do in my mid to late 30s. It was abandon my apartment and move in with them, but thank goodness they were available to me.
But basically a very human thing, right? We feel like frazzled, scared, and we want to be near somebody who loves us and cares for us, and so I guess that was where you stayed there. You felt taken care of. You felt that there was somebody there that you could talk to. It's something like that. It felt easier in a way, right?
Yeah, the support system, and I was in no state to be grocery shopping even at that point. Like I couldn't fathom doing anything. So yeah, fortunately they were there for me as always.
That's so wonderful. I'm so glad you had your parents, of course. But that said, it sounds like now sleep is becoming this huge thing that you probably spent like most of the waking hours thinking about. Is that true? And how are things going with work, and how are you functioning at this point and going forward?
Yeah, it's 100% of my life at this point. This sort of last phase I was talking about, this all took place the week of Thanksgiving when I'm off work. So I start spiraling. I go to New York City. I'm moving with my parents. I get through the Thanksgiving holiday, obviously miserable, like my whole family could tell, and like kind of skipped all the holiday parties and this and that. But at that point, so I'm not working that week, but I'm working the following week, and I also had my intro meeting with the CBT-I therapist that Monday. So I'm like, yeah, I'm just completely frazzled, but I'm like, let me get back to work. That'll be a good distraction. So it's not all day of like lying on the couch and, stewing. And then I'll meet with her and things will start, moving in the right direction. So I was like, I just need to make it through these few days. And that's what I did. And I'm like I said, I'm basically in crisis mode at this point. Like I'm completely distraught. I'm not sleeping, extremely anxious, depressed, etc. Spending all day on the couch and all night, like just Googling all things insomnia, which is, I'm sure, a common experience amongst me and everyone else that goes through this, looking up the health impacts of sleep deprivation and cures and side effects of all these medicines I'm now taking. And also sort of worth noting at this point is, once I move in with my parents, is when my dad reveals to me that he struggled from insomnia for 38 years. And I won't delve much into his whole personal story. That's a whole other, episode. But I will say, he's been sleeping well the past 10 years, thankfully. So that's all good. But it's funny because here I am, like basically like a week into this of like really experiencing it. And I'm just like complete downward spiral. And he did it for 4 decades. And I grew up, I had no idea. No, not a clue. I only remembered like the 10 years prior when he started taking some proactive steps of like sleep test, sleep apnea test, etc., doing this, that, and the other thing. And then it passed and he slept great as far as we've shared hotel rooms many times. And like, it never occurred to me. And then now,
just to
go ahead.
Stop you for a second. Like when he tells you that, like, is it kind of like, does it scare you because you're thinking it's like, oh my gosh, I have what you had, or is it kind of more like, oh, I'm not the only one, or how did you react to that?
Yeah, gift and a curse. The gift being, oh, there's someone else who gets it, because no one does. Unless you've been through it, you don't get it. Try as you might. And I didn't get it before, because like, again, he had gone through it, and I'm just like, how do you have trouble sleeping? Like, it's, I could sleep anywhere, anytime, as they say. But the curse side of it was, he's my closest blood relative. I get 50% of my DNA from him, and this happened to him. So of course it's happening to me now. It was just waiting to be unlocked. So that again cemented like, oh, this doesn't just snap back to normal. And this could be it. This might just be how I am at this point.
Wow. All right. And thanks for sharing this. And then, so I think next, kind of one of the big next steps here is like you're now meeting the CBT-I therapist. Like, tell us about that. How did that go?
Yeah. So we meet that Monday. It was like hour and a half, 2-hour session. My hopes were admittedly pretty low going into it, because I'd already tried sleep restriction. And I mentioned before, not really placing much faith in sleep hygiene, because again, I could have slept under any conditions before. So I really knew my insomnia was tied to that singular event, and that was the trigger. And how do you fix that? So, just despite my low hopes, you'll try anything at that point. I thought I had to give it a fair shake. So I was all in, even though in the back of my mind, I'm like, eh. But the session went relatively well. But that evening, actually, I just downward spiraled ever worse than before. And that's when my parents really just intervened. At that point, they were comforting me and, meet with this therapist and this and that. And, you'll get going. Like, look at your father. He's been through this. It can be fixed. But I was just completely out of sorts. And that's when they really intervened and said, you can't fix this on your own. We can't help you beyond what we're doing right now, which is just supporting you. And so you need real professional help of some variety. And I said, okay, like, I'm not in the mental condition right now to make these decisions for myself. So whatever you tell me to do is what I'll do. And they advised that I check into the hospital. And so that's what I did.
Wow. And yeah, I mean, for them to say that, they must have seen you being really, really distraught, in a really difficult place. But how, in a sort of, more technical aspect of this, like how did they say, did you like go to an emergency room, like a psychiatric emergency room, or was that, yeah?
Yep. So this was a Monday evening when they said, let's first thing tomorrow morning, we'll take you. And that night, I took the Seroquel, whatever I could get my hands on, slept like an hour. And then Tuesday morning, my mom made some calls to see, like, let's see if we can like expedite and get you, immediate help. And I went up and called into work, and I spoke actually to my boss's boss, because my boss was an hour behind. I'm like, she was available. Let me talk to her, and told her what was going on. And kudos to her and everyone else I work with. Were extremely supportive this whole time. And she just basically told me, do what you got to do. So I notified I'd just be off for, I don't know how long, but hopefully back at some point. And my dad drove me to the hospital, and we went in to the emergency room. And what's sort of the norm these days is there's like 1 million people in the waiting room, and Lord knows how long they've been sitting there, but clearly I'm in some sort of crisis. So they get me back pretty quick into the emergency department. And I spend about 24 hours there until they have a bed open up in the psychiatric ward. And that's when I went up there. And that in itself could be a whole call, so I won't get into all the minutia. The cruel irony, sort of the worst part of it, was I could practically see my apartment from the window of like the common room and in the ward I was in. So that was like, oh, hey, there, you know, 3 months ago, that was my life and everything was going great. And like career was taking off and personally, and everything was great. And now like I'm up in here and, you know, is this my life now? Have I forever changed? And like, you know, cause most of the people in there, that I'm speaking with are like, you know, oh, first timer, like this is, you know, I spent a year here and I've spent 2 years there. And this is, you know, this is just kind of, that was kind of their life, was like just in and out of these places. And, you know, ultimately that was just such a surreal experience. Not something anyone I think ever imagines they'd go through, but, you know, looking back, I'm thankful that resource was there for me because, you know, it basically saved my life. It's what I needed at the time. And, you know, everyone was there, was great. The other patients, the doctors, the nurses, and the staff. So I spent 6 total nights in the hospital trying this various, you know, prescription cocktails, the combinations of this, that, and the other thing, all just trying to get me to sleep. And, you know, meeting with a psychiatrist there and asking him, well, what do I got to do to get out of here? I just want to, you know, and I just want to see you get some sleep. So, you know, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, that is the standard treatment for insomnia. You know, it's a lack of research and knowledge, I guess. And it's, you know, big pharma on the other hand, probably altogether. But basically it's give this, you know, this person, give them some drugs and knock them out. And when those stop working, give them some more drugs and then give them some different ones. And really every medical professional I interact with up to this point all told me the same thing, which is basically, here, take this. And then when I express concern, like, okay, and then in 2 weeks when this doesn't work anymore, you know, what's the deal? And they're all basically like, you'll get back to sleeping normal again. You know, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. And no one could tell me how or when or why I might get back to sleeping normal again, but just, yeah, you'll be fine and you'll live a normal life and don't even worry about it. So that wasn't the most reassuring part, that no one could really give me an answer. But again, I was there 6 straight nights, and it was finally after that 6th night, I slept 6 straight hours, which is not like the greatest, but at that point was far improved from what I was doing. And that was, I think I took 100 milligrams of Seroquel that night, and they had me on 12.5 milligrams of Zoloft daily. And so that's what it took to get me out of there.
Wow. And so I think we might have talked about this in a call, or maybe somebody else shared something very similar. But I think the idea then becomes something like, okay, we have this kind of cocktail, this combination that seems to work. Let's get you home and hope it continues to work, something like that. But
right.
Anyway, I'm also so glad that, you know, things were, you know, this kind of stabilized. It was helpful for you at the time. But yes, so they find this combo that seems to help. You're discharged. And what happens next?
Yeah. And they were very clear with me, like, this is not a long-term facility. We just want to get you like baseline stabilized, get you out of here. And then, you know, obviously there's outpatient treatment you can seek, but, you know, you're not staying here terribly long. So I get out of there. I go back to my parents' house. I continue with those medications they gave me. And I am, you know, a few nights getting like 8-9 hours sleep, it kind of just knocking me out. But I'm really skeptical of the Seroquel. It made my heart race. Like, I have a pretty low resting heart rate, and it was like 20-30 beats per minute higher. I could just be sitting here and it was like beating out of my chest. And also read about all sorts of terrible long-term side effects from taking that drug. So I wasn't too keen on staying on it too long. And, you know, the sleep I was getting wasn't great. I wasn't dozing off. I wasn't feeling tired. It was take the Seroquel, get in bed, read for a while, and then estimate, well, it takes about an hour to kick in. So turn out the lights and just lay here till it knocks you out. And then the next morning you just kind of snap to. And so it wasn't optimal. But fortunately, I also at that time started working with a psychiatrist locally that specializes in sleep issues. And that was a few weeks after my hospital stay. I linked up with him, and he switched me from the Seroquel to the Doxepin. as sort of the primary medicine for sleep, and also up my Zoloft to 50 milligrams from 12 and a half or 25, whatever I was taking at that point, which wasn't much. And, similarly around that time, I returned to work. So I was off that week of Thanksgiving, and then in the hospital the following week, and then tried to return the next week, but I needed to give them like a 72-hour notice. So I was off for like a few weeks. And fortunately I can work remotely. So I didn't have to go in an office. I was able to just work from home or my parents' house at that point, and really wanted to get back to work, because at this point, so much of my life is just spiraling out of control. And I'm like, here's this one thing, like I can control this. I can hopefully keep doing this. And, also I've worked hard to get to where I am in my career, and I don't want this thing to destroy it and go back to square one. So I stuck at it with the work. And then my free time was basically back to like, let me lay on the couch all day, either depressed, staring at the ceiling for hours, or pull out the laptop and just Google away on all things insomnia. And, you go down these rabbit holes. And, I mentioned that mostly because I think most people in the insomnia, experience do it, but that also led me to the insomnia subreddit, which is not a place I encourage just people to spend a lot of time. It can be pretty demoralizing, but the one benefit is that is where I learned about you and learned about the sleep coach school. So there was like a pinned post at the top of the subreddit of like, comprehensive insomnia medications and treatments. And the like second most upvoted comment in there was about sleep coach school and natto method. I'm like, well, what's this? And there's all these comments like, yep, this is it. This is the only thing. Like, this is the only cure, blah, blah, blah. And so that's when I said, well, let me check this out. And I go to the website and the YouTube channel and et cetera, and just started kind of devouring the videos. And, you were really the first person I came across in like the insomnia space that spoke of the insomnia experience in a relatable way. And that's when I knew, like, oh, this might be something, because we've talked about earlier, like how it begins and the emotions, and even the things like the hypnic jerks, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm experiencing, like, other people do this. Okay. So like all of it. So, and then, the success story videos like this were like such a huge thing for me, because like, oh, other people have gone through this and come out the other side. And even like, I'm getting so deep into the weeds that I'm like reading the Apple Store reviews for the BedTyme app like 3 times a day, and pretty much everyone is like 5 stars and like, this saved my life. The only ones that aren't are like people who forgot their password and like think that's the app's fault or something. So but as you know, so this was like December, and I don't think we first spoke till like February or March. So obviously there was a gap there, and that was really because I wanted to stick with the CBT-I and give it the fair shot. So I kept going with that for a while.
Oh, wow. Thanks. Yeah. This is, I always ask about exactly this. Like, how did you find us? You share that in such a nice way. And I didn't know about that pinned post. That's so nice.
Yeah.
But that's it. I also wanted to ask about what happened to the CBT-I. It's because of course you had this, like, the first night after you met this therapist, that's when things really spiraled, and you had this like really the admission and everything, but you still went back. And what happened after that?
Right. So shortly after the hospital stay, I re-engaged with the CBT-I therapist. And the first few weeks, he really just had me keeping a sleep journal to use as sort of a baseline, which is, the first element of torture in CBT-I, of like, oh, let me remind myself every morning how much I didn't sleep. And if you wake up in the middle of the night, you're not allowed to look at the clock at all. So I don't know what time I'm falling asleep. I don't know what time I'm waking up, et cetera. In the middle of the night, I only really look in the morning, but you have to guesstimate all that. So, you know how it is. And eventually she implemented sleep restriction for me and started with that midnight to 5 a.m. sleep window, which is basically what I had done myself, and said, really, well, this is the accepted like industry standard minimum. It's basically cruel and unusual punishment to ask someone to try to sleep less than 5 hours. So we tried that, and it was not working. And, I would, again, midnight to 5, I'm still taking doxepin and Zoloft at this point, and like it would take a while to fall asleep. I could wake up 2, 3 times a night and have to get out of bed and read every time, and then go back to bed and still wake up like an hour and a half before my alarm. So do the math. I'm not sleeping much, and it's basically torture. I did actually, a couple weeks into that sleep restriction, got in touch with my psychiatrist. I'm like, I wanted to just stop the doxepin because it's kind of counterintuitive to take this and try to restrict my sleep, because it did eventually, a couple weeks in, started to hit where like I'm feeling drowsy on the couch and this and that, and having trouble staying awake eventually. But I'm kind of attributing it to the doxepin. I'm like, this is just counterintuitive. So I cut that out, and miraculously, I guess, things kind of even got better after I did that. And so for about 10 days after I stopped the doxepin and got into Zoloft, I was kind of back to normal. Like I was falling asleep regularly, had hit the pillow, I'm out, still restricting sleep to, I don't know, 4 hours a night, but like feeling drowsy throughout the day, struggling to stay awake, feeling that like overwhelming tiredness, and feeling like my old self again, most importantly, like going out and socializing. So unfortunately, that phase was pretty short-lived. I woke up before my alarm one morning while doing the whole like sleep restriction thing. So I went from like can't stay awake for like a week and a half, to all of a sudden wake up one morning after like 3 hours sleep, wide awake, and I'm like, oh, that's a little weird. And actually, that night I did a home sleep apnea test, which had something that was planned. I knew I didn't have sleep apnea, but again, it's like whatever I can do at this point, because what are my options? And I got a terrible night's sleep that night, which granted, I've got things up my nose and on my finger and strapped my chest. But that's when I was just like, all right, like this isn't the right path for me. And like this was like a Monday, and my mood and my sleep just took a turn for the worse again. I told the CBT-I therapist that I was done, and she tried to convince me to stay. And she's like, this is one little bump in the road, and it's not the Zoloft that's making you sleep. But I'm like, consciously, I'm like, well, every time I up my dose, like I sleep better, I feel better, and so I'm really delegating a lot to the Zoloft. But I was again, not doing great at that exact point, so I did up my dose again to 75 milligrams. And started to sleep again, but my mood was not great, and I was not doing too well on that front.
Totally. Yeah. So you, at this point, you decided to take a break from the CBT-I, up the Zoloft, but you're not really happy with it. Still unanswered questions, still some confusion, but you have been kind of consuming our content now for a while. And is this the point where you decide to schedule a call with me, or what happens next?
Very close. Very close. We're getting there. I actually then up to 100 milligrams. And I initially resisted. The psychiatrist had prescribed the 100. I'm like, that's just one step further away from getting off of it, which is what I wanted to do. But I'm like, all right, he hasn't steered me wrong yet. And he's actually an old family friend, the psychiatrist. I went to school with his daughter, and great man, and very well, basically like a local legend in the psychiatry field. So I'm like, well, this guy knows what he's talking about. He wouldn't steer me wrong. So I stuck with his plan. And the sleep was choppy at first on 100 milligrams. But actually, I did implement like timeless sleep window. I'm forgetting the terms now because it's, I never thought I would, but it's kind of a timeless window. And that kind of helped, because I wasn't waking up at 2 a.m. and going, it's 2 a.m. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and just lay there, and whatever happened. And after a few weeks, I was mostly sleeping through the night, probably like 6 to 7.5 hours. Not my normal like 7.5, 8, but passable. But experiencing bad side effects, night sweats, headaches all day, no matter like, and I'd pop ibuprofen, didn't matter, like nonstop headaches. And my sleep was still far from normal. So my sleep before insomnia, I always, I'd liken to like a dimmer switch where it's like, oh, I'm fading at night and like getting tired and I'm out. And then in the morning, it's like you come to and slowly like you're kind of half asleep and then you wake up and you don't want to get out of bed and this and that. Whereas after insomnia, any sleep I got was more like the traditional light switch of like, I could stay up and up and up. I could lay in bed reading, watching, streaming something, didn't matter. It was only when I said, well, let me turn out the lights and put my head on the pillow. Then I would just conk out. And in the morning or at whatever point I wake up, it was just immediately like sleep to awake, just very abrupt. And beyond just the sleep, because again, it's such a mental struggle. My mind was really just still completely occupied by insomnia. Like, where is this going? Is it getting better? Is it going to get worse? And really, I aspired, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, to discontinue the Zoloft at some point. And that was still a scary idea at that point for a couple of reasons. One was because I was delegating my sleep and really my mood to Zoloft. So I'm like, when I stop taking this, it could go south. And really that's the second reason. It was like, okay, if I start tapering off, very good chance that I go right back where I was. But ultimately, I was still far from where I wanted to be. And I was sort of sick of living in limbo. And I wanted to get back to both sleeping and feeling like normal. So that is when I decided to engage with you for the first time.
All right. Wow. So yeah, you told your story very nicely with all the ups and downs and all the phases of this. And on my end, I remember I had we had a very nice conversation, and you already had a lot of insight. But on mine, I remember thinking that I think Robert is, some people that I have calls with are sort of like, they only have a few questions, and I can tell that they probably don't have that many more questions, and that's very nice. But I sort of sense that you probably had more questions, and that there was a little bit of, a little more of a path left for you, and that's why I was like, I think you would be a good fit for the immunity program. But on your end, I'm just curious now, how did the call feel on your end? Was it like helpful? Were you still skeptical, or what was it like?
No, it felt great. Again, it was, you're someone who gets it. And so it was nice to have that connection. And so it was really nice. And I did, like you said, I felt like the Insomnia Immunity program was really for me at that point. And, I probably came into the program as sort of a unique situation, which is I was sleeping some. I wasn't in like this terrible spiral of emotions and stuff. And my lowest point really was behind me when I joined, but I didn't know that at that point. So I fully, like I mentioned previously, intended to taper off Zoloft and thought, okay, once I do that, things are going to go back where they were and be very uncomfortable. And so I looked at, sort of the Insomnia Immunity program as this is going to give me the tools and the confidence I need to do that, which it did. And my first couple months, though, I was still on the Zoloft. They want you to stay on 6 months, any SSRI, or you risk like a high risk of regression. So I was on the Zoloft. I was about 4 months in when I joined the program. So I had about 2 months where I was kind of like in this holding pattern of like, I'm absorbing all this information. And then once I can taper, that's when like I'll really apply it. So it's like, it's hard to apply some of the teachings when I could sleep 7 hours a night, maybe. It's hard to like, let me befriend wakefulness. It's hard to do when you're asleep. So I was in that sort of holding pattern, and it was kind of weird, but I was very much still delegating sleep to Zoloft at that point, despite what everyone else told me. Like, no, like it's not all like you're doing this yourself. But I was very much delegating. But there were some high points during that sort of 2 months period. So one major milestone was I moved back to my apartment where I am now, and that felt like sort of a step back to normalcy. And I also slept great my first night back. Like I used to love like a Friday night, like get off work at 5, I'm exhausted, eat, and like just hop on the couch and zonk out at like 7 o'clock. And like, so my first night back was like, I'm going on the couch and putting on TV. And like, that's what I did. And I fell asleep till like 2 a.m. And then I got up and went to my bed and slept some more. And yeah, that was wonderful. And then the other really major turning point was I had this week-long work trip to Salt Lake City where my company's headquartered. And I was kind of building up to that, like my first 2 months in the program, where it's just like holding steady, but like I have this on the horizon. Like, how's that going to go? And I've commonly slept on airplanes and trains and cars, you name it. But I went into this figuring, well, there's no way I'm going to sleep on this plane. And I just didn't care, though, was the thing. Because in my mind, I'm like, how much of my life do I spend on airplanes? You know,
Yeah.
1 or 2 work trips a year. Like, you know, it's not the end of the world if I can sleep okay at night in a bed, but don't sleep on airplanes. So lo and behold, I go to fly out of Syracuse on a Sunday night, and I'm just waiting in the terminal for my flight, reading a book, and I start to doze off right then and there, which was kind of like this magic moment. And then I connected through Dallas to Salt Lake City, both going and coming, and so 4 flights total, and I either slept or was close to falling asleep, barring outside factors on every one of those flights. You know, if it weren't for like the flight attendant asking if I wanted a drink when I clearly have my eyes closed, or like the seat being really uncomfortable, like I would have slept on all of them. And I didn't sleep actually great when I was in Salt Lake City, maybe a few hours a night. It was just super busy, which was great though, because I wasn't sleeping great, but my mind was, for the first time in a long time, occupied with something else. So I wasn't too hung up on the fact that I wasn't sleeping. And the timing of that of that trip was really perfect, because I started tapering off the Zoloft the week I returned from Salt Lake City, having been on it for about 6 months exactly at that point. But, you know, and again, I had this vision of like, here we go. Like, this is going to not be a fun summer because I'm going to be awake the whole time, this and that. But I say the timing was perfect because I had internalized all the teachings from the program at that point. So like I was ready, whatever happened. I didn't care, whatever. Like I knew I had to do this. And when I got back from Salt Lake City, it was like a switch had flipped. And like that, whatever few days between when I got home on like a Friday to my next psychiatrist appointment on a Wednesday, I was back to normal sleep-wise. Like I was zonking out at night. I was napping on the couch. Like it was just like 100% normal. So I knew like, oh, that's in there somewhere. I just have to draw it out, you know, not through the use of prescription medication, but myself somehow. And so that was sort of where I was at that point. And then that's when I, you know, began to taper. So the plan was, I spoke to the psychiatrist and he basically said, all right, well, we'll give you the option. You want to do it slow or fast, 25 milligrams every 2 weeks or 25 milligrams every month you drop by. And I said, again, you know, I'm in your hands. You haven't led me wrong. So whatever you think works. And he said, okay, we'll do the biweekly drop. But if anything feels wrong, just let me know. And like, we can put you right back up, which I said, okay, fine. But in my head, I'm like, well, it's going to go wrong, obviously, like because I have insomnia and I'm just masking it with a Zoloft. But I'm going to play it cool because I figure in my head, now I have to go through this to recover. Like I have to go to the bottom again and start over and rebuild and train my brain like that everything's okay. And so, the first day of my taper, of course, all I think all day is, oh, I wonder if I'll sleep tonight. I wonder if I'll sleep tonight. And that thought is no more, no stronger than when I'm laying in bed that night and I put my head on the pillow to sleep and, laying there, wonder if I'll fall asleep. And I just kind of, it's intrusive thought. You can't, the more you try to push it away, the worse it gets. So I just kind of let it run its course and just logically reminded myself like, hey, you've been taking this medication for 6 months at this dosage, and like one day of 25% less is not actually going to have any impact at all. And so I ended up sleeping pretty well that night. And I did have some speed bumps during my taper, a few stretches where it was like maybe 4 hours of sleep a night for a few nights in a row and not feeling terribly tired in between. So I'm like, okay, this is, and then I'm thinking, okay, and then I drop another 25 and I sleep 2 hours a night and then I'm down to 0. Just ultimately thinking, yeah, I'm just heading back to sleepless nights. But again, thinking, I don't necessarily care. I don't want to. I'd prefer not to, but like, this is what I need to do. And now I'm armed with the tools I need to address it. But I did my best not to get attached to the outcome, as you say. So if I had a bad night, I just went about my day and tried not to think about it too much. And, what ultimately happened was things would just kind of improve when I had that mindset. So it would be like, okay, 4 nights I didn't sleep more than a few hours. But when it's just like, who cares? Like, this is temporary and this is what you have to do. And, a year from now, you'll hopefully look back and laugh at this, which I can now. And it hasn't even been a year. That just, and, something would click when it's just like, stop caring. And all of a sudden, oh, look, I just slept 8 hours. So that kind of brought me to the end of the program and my graduation from Insomnia Immunity.
So nice. And that was what was that? Maybe like 4 months ago, 3 months ago, or something like that?
Not even, maybe two-ish.
You
maybe
too?
two-ish.
Okay.
Yeah.
And had you already weaned completely off at that point or no?
Yeah. So current state today really is I've been off the Zoloft 2-something months, and it was probably, and I was staying, because there was a stretch where I was in Insomnia Immunity and I'm going to like the drop-in classes, and there's people who are like in terrible states, and I'm just getting on like, I'm doing okay, I'm sleeping okay, like I almost feel bad, like I'm not gonna waste your time, but at least I'm here and you can see like, hey, this is possible. But so I planned like, well, I'm staying in the program through my taper. So even though I'm doing okay now, like, then taper is gonna happen. I'm gonna be right back where these other people are, and that's when I really need the program. And then I tapered, and it was like 2 weeks later, and I'm like, I don't know, things are fine, and I can rejoin if I need to. But right now, it's just kind of, I'm wasting everyone's time, and so like I'm like, oh, it's time to go. So the first few weeks, once I finished tapering and graduated from the program, I slept decently, but was still not back to that normal of like, oh, I'm so tired at night, like I gotta sleep, and like, and I longed for that. Like that's where I wanted to be. But in the last few weeks, even maybe a month, things have just improved greatly. So again, like I said, like anytime I'm in a rut, I just try to adjust my perspective. So if it's at one point, maybe like a few weeks ago, I was getting like 6 straight hours of sleep a night. And that's fine, but it's not ideal. I wanted to sleep until my alarm went off or something close to it, that like 8 hours of, kind of the normal sleep length for, I guess, most people. And I'd get hung up on that a few days, like, I'm up at like 3 a.m. again and blah, blah, blah. And again, I just kind of stopped fixating on the issue and was like, even if I have to live the rest of my life this way, like it's fine. I'm doing okay. I'm getting by in all aspects of my life. It's not my ideal, but whatever. And next thing you know, that I'm back to like sleeping until the alarm, and now I'm right back was where I was before I started, I would say.
It's amazing. Such a, you completed the arcs in such a nice way, in real life, and storytelling wise also was so nice to hear. And it's so counterintuitive, like the whole, like exactly as you said, like when you're like, it's okay if this happens, it doesn't happen. If you're like, this cannot happen, then it happens. It's very counterintuitive, but stories like yours is like really what makes it, gives people hope and sees that it is possible. Now, I had a few questions for you. One was, for somebody tuning in here, they may wonder, like, what exactly did Robert learn? What was the aha moments, or what was he? So if you could maybe mention one or two or a few things that maybe kind of like that you learned either from the free content or in the program or from my caller, or something that made a difference for you.
Yeah. And this is not just like sleep related, but it's like wider applicability in that, like, and it's funny because now I just like I'm attuned to look for it. So I see other articles pop up about like, here's the one way to cure anxiety and this and that. And I look and it's all the same, which is like, don't avoid it, but also don't feed into it. And so a lot of people, that's like a big thing now I've been reading, where there's very high truancy rates, if you will, like a lot of absenteeism of students from elementary and high schools. And it kind of became normalized during the pandemic where like you're not at school every day. And now there are kids who might struggle with some sort of social anxiety and this and that, and their parents doing what they think, is best and acting in the best interests of the children, and who could blame them? But, oh, you don't want to go to school, you don't have to go to school. But then you reinforce like, oh, I'm safe here, and I avoided that situation because that situation is actually dangerous, and so I have to stay away from it, where it's not. So you need to really train your brain the opposite, where like, nobody likes feeling left out or awkward at school, and most of us have been there, but like it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things, like, and that's kind of the biggest takeaway.
100%. It's basically, you're describing this like the teaching around like perceived threats and real threats. Like we can get the idea that being in a social, like in an environment with other kids where they're like, we can think like, oh, they don't like me, or they think this about me. Oh, this is dangerous. And then our brain gets confused, thinks it's a real threat. And if we treat it like that, then, the idea gets cemented. So very, very helpful to see this. And two more questions. One was, if you could, let's say, go back in time to, when this started becoming a real issue for you, what would you tell yourself?
What would I tell myself? It's weird to say this, but like, I don't know if I would change anything. And again, because like I've talked about, like I saw your program and I saw all these people that had great success with it, well before I joined. But I think if it were like, I can't, who knows what would have happened if it was like a week into this and I discovered you and your program then. I don't know if I would have been like, I don't need that, because like, again, I'm going to snap right back. So it's like, it's almost like, and it's funny because I've watched all these, and there's a lot of people who go, well, actually, I'm glad I went through insomnia. And when you're in the thick of it, you're like, you can't believe that. What's wrong with you? Like, who would be glad? And there's certainly aspects of it I could have done without, basically like 8 months of my life are like, wiped out, where I just kind of was in this stagnant mode. But what I think I've come out the other end a better person, and, a better mindset on life, in terms of like, life is short. Don't wait around to do what you want to do, and like go out and enjoy yourself and do everything you want. And again, like so much of what you think matters. Like when your life is reduced to like this very basic thing, which I liken to like, like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I couldn't recall from Psych 101 however many years ago, but like, up here is like this self-actualization of like, I want to change the world and like, what's my purpose in life? But when you're at the bottom of the pyramid, it's like, I need food, shelter, water, and health. And so when you're brought all the way down from like the second, third, fourth level to the bottom, you realize so much of what we think is important in life isn't. And you just want that, like, I just want to be normal. Like, I just want to get back where I was and be normal and healthy. And then once you do that, which I've done, now you go back and you're like, oh man, stuff I thought was important in life is just, stupid. And like, I now have this whole new mindset, I guess.
100%. Wow, amazing. And that, you already answered my kind of standard last question, which is like, have you learned things that are applicable to other aspects of life? And you just shared that in such an amazing way. So I'll just say, Robert, it's so wonderful to have had your story here, and we'll conclude there. And I just want to thank you so much for being here and sharing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daniel. I mean, thank you for everything.
Anytime. Be in touch now.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.